The scalpel trembled in my hand, withdrawal shaking my bones as the OR plunged into black. Mark Miller's chest was open on the table, his life bleeding out through my fingers. The backup generator sputtered, and the orderly lunged with a stolen blade, eyes wild for the narcotics cabinet. One wrong move, and the man I'd already failed would die again, this time by my hand. Then his eyes flicked open. "I saw you take it," he whispered. "The fentanyl. The lie. The truth clawing its way out." The overhead LEDs flickered once, hummed a dying note, and vanished. Darkness swallowed the theater, leaving only the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the metallic scent of cauterized flesh. David Sterling froze, his gloved fingers buried deep within Mark Miller's chest cavity. The emergency lights kicked in, a sickly, amber dimness that cast long, distorted shadows across the open ribcage. The aorta pulsed beneath David's fingertips, a slick, frantic muscle threatening to tear further. Sweat stung his eyes. He didn't blink. "Scalpel," David muttered. His voice rasped, dry as sandpaper. The nurse fumbled. Metal clattered against the floor tiles. "Sorry, doctor. It's too dark to forceps now." David extended his hand, palm up. He tracked the bleed by touch, mapping the warm, rhythmic spray against his thumb. The pulse felt like a trapped bird fluttering against a cage. Every second of the blackout stretched, measured only by the frantic beep of the heart monitor. "Suction," David commanded. "I can't see the suture line." The machine groaned, struggling on backup power. A thin trail of crimson spilled over the drapes, soaking into David's gown. He angled his head, trying to catch a sliver of the amber glow. The tear was jagged, wider than the pre-op scan suggested. He gripped the needle holder, the steel cold against his palm. One stitch. If he missed the tissue wall by a millimeter, the vessel would shred like wet paper. He held his breath, waiting for the momentary stillness between heartbeats. The monitor shrieked a long, continuous note. Miller's blood pressure plummeted, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a secondary pulse that mocked his professional mask. He could feel the fine, microscopic tremors beginning in his forearms, the first whispers of a body screaming for the chemical numbness it had been denied for 12 hours. He reached into his mind, trying to visualize the grocery list he'd rewritten just 2 nights ago. Milk, eggs, cinnamon, kale. He repeated the words like a mantra, a rhythmic anchor against the rising tide of the shakes. The amber light was insufficient, casting the surgical field into a landscape of deep red canyons and deceptive shadows. He needed the needle to bite exactly where the tissue was strongest. But the world was beginning to blur at the edges. "Doctor, his pressure is bottoming out," Sarah Johnson said, her voice a cool, analytical blade cutting through the hum of the failing equipment. She didn't look up from her monitors, her face illuminated by the pale green glow of the anesthesia station. She was mirroring David's own rigid posture, her shoulders squared, her movements precise. She was the ghost in the room, the one who saw everything but said nothing. Her presence a constant reminder of the thin line between life and the void. Robert Hayes stood on the other side of the table, his massive frame blocking what little light remained. He didn't move to help. He simply watched. David could feel Robert's eyes on his hands, tracking the slight, rhythmic twitch of his fingers. Robert counted the ceiling tiles, his chin tilting up in that predatory grid pattern, staking his claim on the chaos. The air smelled of ozone and old blood, a heavy, cloying mixture that made every breath a struggle. "Steady," David whispered to himself. the word lost in the whine of the ventilators. He forced his hand to be still, locking his elbow against his side. The needle pierced the adventitia, a tiny, silver arc in the gloom. He pulled the suture through, the silk thread singing against the gloved latex. 1 stitch, 2. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. He wasn't out of the woods, but the immediate threat of the patient emptying his life force onto the floor had been momentarily stayed. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a thick, invisible fog that made every movement feel sluggish. Sarah adjusted the flow of the paralytic, her fingers dancing over the dials with a practiced, hollow grace. She noticed the way David's chest heaved, the way the sweat had turned from a light sheen to a drenching mask. She knew the signs. She had seen the way he retreated to the staff bathroom every 4 hours, the way he emerged with pupils like pinpricks and hands that finally, mercifully, stood still. Now, those hands were a liability, a pair of broken instruments trying to perform a miracle in the dark. "The backup generators are straining," Robert said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "We're losing the secondary scrubbers. If the air doesn't circulate, we're breathing our own exhaust." He didn't sound worried. He sounded like a man observing a weather pattern. He adjusted his position, his large hand brushing against the tray of instruments, the metal clinking with a sharp, discordant ring. David ignored him, focusing entirely on the rhythmic hiss of the bypass machine. It was the only sound that mattered, the mechanical breath of a man who was currently more machine than human. Milk, eggs, cinnamon, kale. The list was a lifeline, a connection to a woman who had died on a table just like this one, under hands that had shaken just like these. The memory of Jennifer's face, pale and still under the harsh surgical lights, threatened to break through his concentration. He shoved it back, burying it under the cold, clinical reality of the present. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the OR burst open with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. A man in a stained orderly's uniform lunged into the room, his eyes wide and wild, reflecting the amber emergency lights. It was Christopher Brown, his face slick with sweat, his knuckles cracking in a rapid-fire sequence as he moved. In his hand, a stolen scalpel glinted, a tiny, lethal sliver of silver. "I need it," Christopher screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I know where you keep the good stuff. Open the cabinet." The room froze. The intruder's presence was a jagged tear in the sterile reality of the surgery. He scrambled toward the narcotics locker, his boots sliding on the bloody tiles. Robert Hayes moved with surprising speed for a man of his size, stepping into the orderly's path. But Christopher swung the scalpel in a wide, frantic arc, forcing Robert back. David didn't hesitate. The instinct to protect his theater, his patient, and his supply overrode the tremors. He stepped away from the table, his movements fluid and sharp, fueled by a sudden spike of adrenaline that cut through the withdrawal. He caught Christopher's wrist as the man lunged again, the bone-on-bone impact a dull thud in the silence. David twisted, using the man's momentum against him, pinning him against the cold steel of the supply cabinet. The scalpel clattered to the floor, a harmless piece of metal once more. "Security!" Sarah shouted, her voice finally breaking its clinical calm. David held the man down, his weight pressing Christopher into the cabinet. He could smell the sour scent of the orderly's fear, the metallic tang of his desperation. For a moment, their eyes met. 2 addicts, one in a white coat and one in blue, both drowning in the same sea of chemical need. Then the security team arrived, dragging Christopher away into the darkness of the hallway. David returned to the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at Mark Miller, the man whose life hung by a thread of silk and a prayer. He leaned in to check the vitals, his face inches from the patient's masked head. Subverted. David leaned in, his ear close to Mark's mouth, to listen for any sign of respiratory distress that the monitors might be missing in the low-power state. He felt a surge of professional pride. He had protected his team. He had secured the room. Despite the tremors, despite the darkness, he was winning. He was the great David Sterling, the man who could operate in a hurricane. He felt a rare moment of clarity, a belief that this surgery would be his redemption, the act that finally balanced the scales for the life he had lost a year ago. "You're going to make it, Mark," David whispered. A promise meant more for himself than the patient. "I've got you. The bleed is controlled. We're going to get you through this." He watched the patient's eyes. Mark's eyelids fluttered, a minute movement that David initially dismissed as a side effect of the fluctuating anesthesia levels. But then, the fluttering stopped. Mark's eyes opened wide, staring directly into David's. They weren't the vacant, glassy eyes of a sedated patient. They were sharp, burning with a terrifying, lucid intensity. Mark's hand, which had been limp at his side, twitched. His lips moved, struggling against the dryness, against the paralytic that should have rendered him a statue. A faint, raspy sound emerged, a ghostly vibration that barely carried over the hum of the room. "I saw you," Mark hissed. David froze, his heart leaping into his throat. "Mark, stay calm. You're in surgery. You're experiencing awareness. It will pass." "No," Mark interrupted, the word a jagged shard of glass. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sprayed a fine mist of blood onto David's mask. "A year ago. My wife, Jennifer." The mention of his wife's name struck David like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The room seemed to tilt, the amber light spinning into a dizzying vortex. "I wasn't fully under," Mark whispered, his voice gaining a horrific, unnatural strength. "I saw your hands, shaking then too. And I saw what you took. From the tray, the little glass vial. You didn't save her, because you needed your fix more than you needed her." The world collapsed. The smart move of stabilizing the patient, the heroic act of disarming the intruder. It all turned to ash. David wasn't a savior. He was a murderer standing over his witness. Mark Miller wasn't just a patient. He was a living record of David's greatest sin. The revelation didn't just compromise the surgery. It stripped David of the very identity he used to survive. He was no longer the brilliant surgeon fighting the odds. He was a thief caught in the act by a man he was currently trying to save. The tremors returned, 10 times worse than before, his hands now vibrating with the force of a tectonic shift. He had wanted to prove he wasn't a failure. But in this moment, he realized he had already failed a year ago, and the man on the table was the only one who knew the truth. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness. David's fingers, still inside Mark's chest, felt the frantic, irregular thump of the heart, a trapped animal screaming for release. The amber lights flickered again, a dying gasp of the backup system. And for a heartbeat, David was back in that other room, a year ago, watching Jennifer's life leak away, while his pockets were heavy with stolen peace. "Doctor?" Sarah's voice was a sharp needle, popping the bubble of his paralysis. "The bypass machine is losing RPMs. We're losing the pressure. You need to finish the graft." David looked at her. But he didn't see the anesthesiologist. He saw a judge. He looked at Robert, and he saw a jailer. He was trapped in a theater of his own making, surrounded by people who were either hunting him or waiting for him to fall. He forced his eyes back to the open chest, the red cavern that now looked like a grave. "Milk, eggs, cinnamon, kale," he whispered. But the words had lost their power. They were just sounds, hollow and meaningless against the weight of Mark's accusation. He picked up the needle holder again, but the steel felt like a foreign object, a cold, mocking reminder of his inadequacy. The bypass machine began to emit a low, rhythmic groan, a mechanical death rattle that signaled the end of its endurance. The 30-minute countdown had begun, and every second was a hammer blow against David's crumbling resolve. He had to move. He had to act. But how could he save a man who wanted nothing more than to see him destroyed? "The primary generator is dead," Robert announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're on the last of the battery arrays. 20 minutes, tops, before the pumps stop entirely." David's hands were no longer just shaking. They were dancing a frantic, uncontrollable jig. He tried to focus on the vena cava, the massive vessel that returned blood to the heart. One wrong move, one slip of the needle, and Mark Miller would be beyond the reach of any miracle. I can't see the margin," David gasped, the sweat now pouring down his face in rivulets. "Use your hands, David," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that made the hair on his neck stand up. "You know the anatomy. You've done this 1,000 times. Don't look with your eyes. Look with your fingers." It was a piece of advice he had given to dozens of residents, a fundamental truth of high-stakes surgery. But coming from her in this moment, it felt like a trap. He reached into the dark, his fingers searching for the familiar contours of the vessel. He felt the pulse, the slickness of the tissue, the heat of the body. He positioned the needle, his body tensed for the strike. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room. Clack, 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 clack. David paused. It was coming from the table. He looked down and saw Mark's index fingers striking the metal edge of the surgical field. It was deliberate, rhythmic. "What is he doing?" Robert asked, leaning in, his face a mask of confusion. David listened. He had spent 3 years in the Navy before medical school. He knew the pattern. M-U-R-D-E-R-E-R. The heart monitor, struggling on its last bits of power, chirped in perfect synchronization with the finger. Each beat of Mark's heart was a syllable of the accusation. The psychological pressure was a physical weight, a crushing force that made David's vision tunnel. He was being tried and convicted in the middle of an operating room, with a dying man as the prosecutor. He's just reacting to the bypass," David lied, his voice a thin, reedy whistle. "It's a neurological bypass effect. Ignore it." But he couldn't ignore it. The tapping was a drumbeat, a march toward his own destruction. He tried to push the needle through the vessel wall, but his hand jerked, the sharp tip grazing the delicate blue surface of the vena cava. A thin line of blood erupted, a new leak in a system that was already failing. "Careful," Sarah hissed. "I've got it," David snapped, though he knew he didn't. He was losing control of the room, of the patient, and of himself. The air in the theater was becoming stale, the scent of blood and ozone replaced by the sour smell of his own fear. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his shoulder as something heavy struck him from above. The overhead light fixture, loosened during the earlier struggle with the orderly, had finally given way. It swung down like a pendulous blade, the heavy metal housing aimed directly at Mark's exposed chest. David didn't think. He lunged across the table, throwing his body over the open wound, his shoulder taking the full force of the impact. The metal bit into his flesh, a dull, crushing blow that sent a shockwave of pain through his arm. He grunted, his teeth baring in a silent scream, but he didn't move. He held his position, his body a human shield between the machine and the man. "Get it off him!" David roared. Robert and the circulating nurse scrambled to catch the fixture, heaving the heavy mass away and securing it with emergency straps. David slumped back, his shoulder throbbing with a rhythmic, white-hot heat. His gown was torn, a dark bruise already forming beneath the fabric. "You okay, doctor?" Robert asked, his voice holding a hint of something that might have been respect or perhaps just curiosity. "Finish the surgery." David wheezed, clutching his arm. He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of water. He needed to get back to the table, but a hand caught his elbow, firm and unyielding. It was Sarah. She leaned in close, her eyes searching his. "Scrub room. Now," she commanded. David followed her, his mind a blur of pain and confusion. The scrub room was a small tiled box, illuminated by a single flickering emergency light. Sarah shut the door, the click of the latch sounding like a guillotine blade. "I know what's in your pocket, David," she said, her voice a cold, level whisper. "And I know why your hands are shaking." David tried to pull away, but she held him fast. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. I'm not just an anesthesiologist. I've been working with the board for 6 months. We've been tracking the inventory. Every vial of fentanyl, every pill that goes missing, it's all logged. And your name is all over the logs, David." The truth was out. The last layer of his defense had been stripped away. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a colleague. He saw the end of his life. "I can save him," David pleaded, his voice breaking. "I just need to finish the surgery. Please." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You have 15 minutes before the bypass fails completely. If Mark Miller dies on that table, you're going out of here in handcuffs. If he lives, maybe we can talk about a deal. But you finish that graft, and you do it now." She pushed him back toward the OR. David stumbled through the doors, the amber light feeling like a spotlight on his failure. He returned to the table, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and determination. He had one chance to save the man who knew his secret, and in doing so, perhaps save a piece of himself. The heart-lung bypass machine began to whine, a high-pitched, mechanical scream that filled the room. The motor was failing, the friction of the unlubricated parts creating a thin trail of smoke that rose into the stagnant air. "Pressure is dropping," Sarah announced, her voice returning to its clinical mask. "We're losing the flow. David, you have to move." David didn't wait. He dove back into the chest cavity, his fingers moving with a desperate, frantic speed. He ignored the pain in his shoulder, ignored the tapping of Mark's finger, ignored the ghost of his wife humming in the corner of his mind. He was a machine now, a collection of reflexes and muscle memory. He positioned the graft, the synthetic tube a pale, lifeless thing in the red landscape of the chest. He began to suture, the needle moving in a rhythmic, hypnotic pattern. 1 stitch, 2, 3. He was winning. He could feel it. The graft was holding, the blood flow was stabilizing. He was going to beat the clock. But then Mark's body convulsed. It wasn't a seizure. It was a localized, powerful muscle spasm, a result of the anesthesia awareness and the fluctuating levels of paralytic in his system. Mark's hand shot up from the table, his fingers curling into a claw. He grabbed David's wrist with a crushing iron grip, pinning his hand directly over the exposed, beating heart. "Stop," Mark rasped, his voice a wet, gurgling sound. David tried to pull away, but the man's strength was unnatural, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated hate. "Mark, let go," David shouted. "You're going to kill yourself." "Good," Mark whispered, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Then we both go down." The struggle was silent and deadly. David pulled, his muscles straining against the man's grip. But he couldn't break free without risking a catastrophic tear in the heart itself. The bypass machine's whine reached a crescendo, then suddenly died, replaced by a terrifying hollow silence. The blood flow stopped. The heart beneath David's hand began to flutter, a frantic, dying bird. "The pump is dead," Sarah screamed. "I can't move," David roared, his face inches from Mark's. "Mark, let go, please." But Mark didn't let go. He held on with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. Suddenly, a spray of hot, metallic-smelling blood hit David in the face. A suture had torn, a jagged rip appearing in the primary vessel where the pressure had built up before the pump failed. The hemorrhage was catastrophic, a crimson fountain that obscured the entire surgical field. "Clamps! I need vascular clamps!" David screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He reached out with his free hand, groping for the sterile tray, but his fingers met only empty space. He looked down and saw the tray was bare. The specialized clamps he needed, the only tools that could stop the flow and allow him to repair the tear, were gone. "Where are the clamps?" David demanded, his eyes darting around the room. He looked at Robert Hayes. The big nurse was standing by the emergency supply cabinet, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He wasn't moving. He wasn't helping. He was smiling, a cold, triumphant expression that chilled David to the bone. "They aren't here, Doctor," Robert said, his voice a low, mocking rumble. "I think you must have misplaced them. Such a shame. Malpractice is a terrible thing to have on your record, especially when it's fatal." The truth hit David like a physical blow. Robert wasn't just a witness. He was the architect of the chaos. He was the one who had been stealing the pills, the one who had been framing David, the one who had ensured the surgery would fail. He wanted Mark to die, and he wanted David to take the fall. "You," David whispered, the word lost in the sound of the blood hitting the floor. "Me," Robert agreed, stepping forward so only David could hear him. "I've been cleaning up after you for a year, David. Every missing vial, every mistake you made, I handled it. But you're a liability now. The board is looking too close. They need a scapegoat, and who better than the brilliant drug-addicted surgeon who killed his own wife?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of peppermint and rot. "Mark Miller is a loose end. Once he's gone and you're in jail, the inventory will stop missing. I'll be the hero who caught the bad doctor. It's a perfect story, don't you think?" David looked down at Mark, whose grip was finally beginning to slacken as his brain was deprived of oxygen. The man's eyes were closing, the light fading from them. The hemorrhage was slowing, not because the leak was fixed, but because there was no blood left to pump. The darkness in the room was almost total now, the emergency lights having finally flickered out. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, a ghostly reminder of the life that was slipping away. David felt a sudden, cold clarity. He was at the bottom of the world, a murderer, a thief, and a failure. He had lost everything, his career, his reputation, his soul. But in the darkness, he felt something else, a memory, not of the grocery list, but of the man he used to be. The man who could operate by touch, who knew every curve and contour of the human heart. He didn't need the clamps. He didn't need the light. He reached into the chest cavity, his fingers finding the torn vessel. He didn't use a tool. He used his hand. He compressed the aorta against the spine, his thumb locking down on the tear with a precision that no machine could match. The flow stopped. "Sarah!" David shouted into the darkness. "Flashlight, now!" A beam of light cut through the gloom, the pale white glow of a phone's LED. Sarah was standing over Robert, her hand on her hip, her face a mask of cold fury. "Look at his pockets, Sarah," David commanded, his voice steady for the first time in years. Sarah moved the light, the beam falling on Robert's cargo pants. The pockets were bulging, the unmistakable shape of surgical clamps and glass vials visible through the fabric. Robert lunged for her, but Sarah was faster. She stepped back, her hand reaching into her own pocket and pulling out a small, black device. A taser. The crackle of electricity filled the room, and Robert collapsed to the floor, his massive body twitching in the dark. "Finish it, David," Sarah said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. David didn't hesitate. He used his free hand to reach for the backup kit, his fingers finding a needle and suture by feel. He worked in the small circle of light provided by the phone, his movements sure and certain. He repaired the tear, his stitches equidistant and perfect. He grafted the vessel, the silk thread singing in the silence. He worked for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. He didn't think about the drugs, didn't think about the board, didn't think about the future. He only thought about the heart beneath his hand. Finally, he was done. He stepped back, his hands covered in blood, his body trembling with exhaustion. "He's stable," David whispered. The lights in the hospital flickered, then surged back to life with a triumphant hum. The primary power was restored. The monitors began to beep, a steady, rhythmic pulse that filled the room with the sound of life. David looked down at Mark Miller. The man's eyes were open again, but the hate was gone. He looked at David, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. "I'm sorry," David said, the word finally finding its way out of his throat. He turned and walked out of the OR, his boots clicking on the bloody tiles. He didn't stop at the scrub room. He didn't stop at his locker. He walked straight to the main entrance, where a group of police officers and hospital administrators were waiting. Subverted, David approached the lead officer, a tall man with a weary face. He felt a strange sense of peace, a belief that by confessing, he was finally doing the right thing. He would tell them everything: the pills, the malpractice, Robert's scheme. He would be the hero of his own downfall, the man who chose the truth over his own survival. He imagined the board's reaction, their shock at his honesty, their gratitude for helping them catch a predator like Robert Hayes. He felt light, almost buoyant, as if the weight of his sins had already been lifted. "I'm Dr. David Sterling," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "I have a full confession to make regarding the narcotics theft and the malpractice involving Jennifer Sterling and Mark Miller. I also have evidence of Nurse Robert Hayes' involvement in a drug distribution ring." The administrator, Michael Davis, stepped forward, his silk tie perfectly adjusted. He didn't look shocked. He looked bored. "Thank you, Doctor," Michael said, his voice a smooth, corporate drone. "We've already reviewed the footage from the OR's internal security system, the one that runs on an independent battery. We saw the whole thing." David smiled, a small, hopeful expression. "Then you know. You know I saved him. You know Robert was the one." "What we saw," Michael interrupted, "was a drug-addicted surgeon having a psychotic break in the middle of a critical procedure. We saw you physically assault an orderly. We saw you lose control of your hands. And we saw you screaming accusations at a senior nurse who was trying to assist you." David's smile vanished. "What?" "No. Robert stole the clamps. Sarah has the evidence." He turned to Sarah, expecting her to step forward, to show the taser, to show the stolen vials. But Sarah was standing next to Michael Davis, her face a blank, professional mask. "Dr. Sterling was highly agitated," Sarah said, her voice cool and detached. "He appeared to be experiencing acute withdrawal symptoms. When the power failed, he became paranoid, accusing Mr. Hayes of sabotage. I had to restrain Mr. Hayes for his own safety after the doctor threatened him with a scalpel. The world didn't just tilt, it inverted." David looked at her, his mouth hanging open. "Sarah, what are you doing? You told me you were an investigator." "I am an investigator for the board, David," Sarah said, her eyes meeting his with a chilling lack of emotion. "And my investigation concluded that you are the sole source of the hospital's liability. Robert Hayes has been a loyal employee for 15 years. You, on the other hand, have a documented history of instability since your wife's death. The board needs a clean resolution, and a rogue doctor is much easier to explain to the press than a systemic drug ring involving our nursing staff." Michael Davis stepped closer, his digital thermometer glinting in the light. "We've already coordinated with the district attorney. Your confession, combined with the testimony of Dr. Johnson and Mr. Hayes, will ensure a swift trial. The hospital's reputation will remain intact, and the rot you mentioned will be removed with surgical precision." David realized then that he hadn't won anything. His smart move of confessing had only provided them with the final piece of the puzzle they needed to bury him. He had handed them his own head on a silver platter. He wasn't the hero of a redemption story. He was the fall guy in a corporate cleanup. The evidence he thought he had was gone, replaced by the testimony of a woman who had mirrored his own desperation just long enough to lead him into the trap. He had saved Mark Miller's life, but in doing so, he had ensured his own destruction. The police officers moved in, their hands reaching for their handcuffs. David didn't resist. He felt a strange, hollow coldness spreading through his chest. He looked back toward the OR, where Mark Miller was being wheeled out on a gurney. Mark looked at him, his pale face reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just watched as David was led away, a silent witness to a truth that no one would ever believe. As the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, David looked down at his hands. They were perfectly still. For the first time in a year, the tremors were gone. He was clean, he was honest, and he was finished. The police led him through the lobby, past the pristine child's tricycle that sat in the center of the waiting room. A silent, clean thing in a world of filth. The air smelled of bleach and old coffee. A sharp, industrial scent that would be the last thing he remembered of St. Jude's Memorial. "Milk, eggs, cinnamon, kale," David whispered. But the words were just a ghost of a memory, a list for a life that no longer existed. He was led out into the cool night air, the sirens of the police cars, a rhythmic, wailing dirge that filled the street. He looked up at the stars, but they were hidden by the city's glow, leaving only a vast, empty darkness. He had saved the patient. He had told the truth, and it had cost him everything. As the car door slammed shut, David felt the silence of the night settle around him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he finally heard it. The low, rhythmic humming of his wife, a funeral dirge that would follow him into the long, quiet years ahead.